In the 10th year of our marriage, Chen Jijing's first love, Bai Yueguang, got divorced. She traveled thousands of miles to the capital, seeking refuge. My parents are gone, my family scorns me. I truly have nowhere else to go, she said. Chen Jijing softened and took her in, attending to her every need, personally overseeing her food, clothing, and daily comforts. My son, Chen Yan, was ecstatic. Aunt Heng, you're so beautiful. When I grow up, I'll marry someone as pretty as you. Definitely not someone like my mom, who always looks unkempt and messy. She's so ugly. At that time, my daughter's fever had just subsided. Hearing this, I turned away and went to my study to write a divorce letter. 3 months ago, a woman named Lu Heng fainted at the gates of the Chen residence. Chen Jijing, returning from court, happened to see her and brought her into our home. At the time, I was tending to my daughter, Anen, who had a relentless fever caused by a cold. I had no knowledge of the incident. When the servant I sent to fetch the family doctor didn't return, I had to go myself. But as I passed by the Hengwu Pavilion, I saw all the household staff gathered there. Even several renowned doctors of the capital were present, deliberating over prescriptions. From the murmured discussions of the servants, I learned that the usually mild-tempered Chen Jijing had been furious that day. He had summoned the best doctors for Lu Heng and gathered nearly all the household staff to attend to her needs. I walked through the crowd and into Hengwu Pavilion. The chatter ceased instantly, and no one dared to stop me. From the doorway, I heard Lu Heng's tearful voice. My parents are gone. My family scorns me. I truly have nowhere else to go. Jijing Gij, please, for the sake of our past feelings, let me stay. Chen Jijing's voice was filled with concern. Don't worry, no one will dare bully you here. I'll always be by your side. Sweat and tears mixed as they fell to the ground. I didn't step inside, but turned and ran out of the mansion. It wasn't until I had visited nearly every medical clinic in the city that I found a skilled doctor willing to make a house call. It took 10 days of care before Anne's condition improved. It was only when a maid reminded me that I realized I hadn't seen Chen Jijing during that time, nor had he asked about his daughter even once. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, I stepped into Hengwu Pavilion. Inside, the scene was lively. People from Genie Pavilion were displaying exquisite silk fabrics one after another, and Chen Jijing watched with a gentle smile, occasionally complimenting the vibrant colors and saying how beautiful Lu Heng would look in them. Even my usually mischievous son, who rarely sat still, was now quietly watching Lu Heng with adoration in his eyes. Aunt Heng, you're so beautiful. When I grow up, I'll marry someone as pretty as you. Definitely not someone like my mom, who always looks unkempt and messy. She's so ugly. Lu Heng chuckled, covering her mouth, and gently chided him. Ah Yen, you mustn't say that. The Genie Pavilion attendant, quick to please, added, The lady of the house is indeed beautiful. I've seldom seen anyone as lovely as her. The courtyard was filled with laughter and warmth, harmonious and joyful. Standing outside, I raised a hand to touch my face. 8 years of wind and sand on the borderlands had long roughened my skin. Since returning to the capital, managing both the household and external matters had left me utterly exhausted, with no time for self-care. The clothes I wore were made during my time at the borderlands, dull in color, outdated in style, completely out of place amidst the luxurious silks and satins of the courtyard. The early winter wind pierced through my heart, abruptly awakening me from 10 years of blind devotion. That night, I wrote the divorce letter and left it in the study. Chen Jijing noticed it the next morning. For once, he stepped into my courtyard, throwing the letter at my feet. Henger is an old friend of mine. Divorce is no trivial matter. Don't use it to threaten me. He was convinced I was trying to coerce him, not even giving me the chance to explain, striding away without a second glance. Watching his retreating figure, I pondered his words. Divorce truly wasn't a trivial matter. The following day, I wrote to my uncle in Songjiang, imploring him to approve my request to return home after the divorce. To return to Songjiang, we had to take the waterway. Standing at the ferry port, I was momentarily dazed. 10 years ago, I embarked alone with my dowry, traveling this same waterway to marry. Later, when the Qin family faced misfortune, Qin Jijing and I also took a boat from this port to the frontier. Now, here I was again, accompanied by family, heading back home. My uncle held in Anne's hand, bending down to patiently tell her stories about the charms of Songjiang. Seeing me lost in thought, he waved at me. "Chang'e, come on, it's time to go." The elderly man, with a face full of kindness, made my nose sting with emotion. I quickly caught up with them. As the boat drifted away from the shore, my uncle sighed. "The past is behind us now. Once you're back home, live a good life. Though our Jiang family is no longer as prosperous, we can still provide for you and the children." "Thank you, uncle," I said earnestly. Years ago, when my parents passed suddenly, my uncle's family treated me like their own daughter, sparing no kindness. When Qin Jijing came with the old marriage agreement to propose, my uncle even prepared a generous dowry for me. 2 months ago, with just one letter from me, he rushed to the capital to seek justice on my behalf, reprimanding the Qin family for their ingratitude, forcing them to sign the divorce papers, and securing custody of Anan. Waving off my gratitude, my uncle said, "No need for thanks within the family. Chang'e, since you've chosen this path, walk forward without looking back. I'm not in the best of health after your aunt's passing. I might not be able to protect you for many more years." Tightening my cloak, I nodded firmly. "I won't look back." The biting cold must have gotten to me, as I felt feverish the next day. Rocked by the swaying of the boat, I drifted into hazy memories. My father had been an ordinary merchant in Songjiang who once, by chance, saved the life of Qin Jijing's grandfather, who was then the local magistrate of Songjiang. The Qin family had wanted to reward my father with wealth, but the poison on the arrow that wounded the magistrate ultimately took my father's life within days. Overcome with grief, my mother, who shared a deep bond with my father, couldn't bear the loss. She left 6-year-old me behind and drowned herself in despair. Out of guilt and gratitude, the Qin patriarch arranged a marriage between his grandson and me, promising at my parents' gravesite. "When Chang'e marries into my family, I will treat her as my own granddaughter, never letting her suffer any injustice. Should I break this oath, may the Qin family face eternal ruin." But alas, 2 years later, the Qin patriarch passed away, and the Jiang family lost contact with the Qins. When I came of age, no one from the Qin family came to fulfill the engagement. My uncle began seeking a suitable match for me, saying that breaking off this marriage was a blessing in disguise. He felt that the high-status Qin family would not be a good fit for us, a modest merchant family, and that I would fare better marrying someone of equal standing in Songjiang, where my family could still protect me. Yet, at the critical moment, Qin Jijing unexpectedly arrived to propose. He was a refined gentleman from a noble family, and I fell for him at first sight, happily marrying into the capital. However, within days of the wedding, the crown prince was placed under house arrest, and as a supporter of the prince, Qin Jijing faced the fallout. He was dispatched to a remote frontier post as a minor magistrate. When my mother-in-law heard the news, she blamed me for bringing misfortune, calling me a jinx. She said I had caused my parents' deaths, and now, just after marrying into their family, I had brought disaster upon her son. Under the scorching sun, I stood in the courtyard, bewildered and helpless as she berated me. I looked toward the approaching Qin Jijing, hoping he would defend me. Instead, he glanced at me briefly before hurrying inside to comfort his mother. Afterward, he explained that he was worried about his mother's frail health and asked for my understanding. In the unfamiliar capital and within the strange confines of my new household, I had no choice but to lower my head and agree. Later, we moved to the frontier. The harsh winds and sands of the region were unbearable for someone like me, who had grown up in the gentle landscapes of the Jiangnan region. I often fell ill. Qin Jijing, too, faced many difficulties. His superiors made things hard for him, his subordinates were insubordinate, and the local people distrusted officials altogether. All of this left him overwhelmed, with little attention to spare for me. To support him, I pushed through my own frailty to attend various social events, building connections with the wives of his superiors. During the farming season, I even worked in the fields alongside the local women to gain the people's favor. Fortunately, my efforts paid off. His circumstances improved, and he became more dedicated to his role. However, he also grew busier, often away from home for weeks at a time. When I became pregnant, he finally made time to care for me. That period was the happiest in our marriage. Our relationship could almost be described as harmonious. But the joy was short-lived. After I gave birth to our son, Chen Yan, his younger brother, came from the capital under orders from my mother-in-law to take the child back to the capital for better education. No matter how I pleaded, Chen Zhijing insisted I comply, saying it would be better for the child's future. The night before his brother left, I went to make a final appeal, hoping we could wait until the child was older. What I overheard stopped me in my tracks. Our sister-in-law is ultimately from a humble background, not as understanding as Miss Liu from the Liu family. If it weren't for that unforeseen disaster, you and Miss Liu might already have children by now, his brother said. Standing at the courtyard gate, I froze, staring blankly at the two of them as they drank together. Chen Zhijing didn't refute him, merely chuckling bitterly. Being sent to this frontier, I'm just thankful it wasn't hunger. She's too delicate. She could never endure this wind and sand. That was the first time I heard Lu Heng's name. Later, I pieced things together and learned that she had been Chen Zhijing's childhood sweetheart. The Chen and Lu families were well-matched in status and had been close friends. The two were on the verge of marrying when, for some unknown reason, Lu Heng suddenly married someone else. Heartbroken, Chen Zhijing turned to his grandfather's arranged match and came to Songjiang to marry me. Everyone in the capital knew of their deep affection for one another and believed they would have made a perfect couple. Everyone except me. I was the only one kept in the dark. I was groggy from the illness, but thankfully, there was a doctor on the boat heading home. He gave me some pills for the cold, and after taking 2, my fever subsided slightly. And I was very worried, constantly gesturing to ask if I felt better. Seeing my obedient and caring daughter comforted me greatly. I softly reassured her. Life on the boat was rather monotonous, especially with the cold weather. Most of the time, I stayed in the cabin with Nin, reading books. Occasionally, we ventured outside for some fresh air. It took over a month before the boat finally reached Songjiang. When I saw the familiar city gates, tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. My cousin, who came to pick us up, scooped Nin into his arms and said softly, "Don't cry now. If you cry, I can still console you, but if the child starts crying with you, I wouldn't know what to do." His words made me laugh despite myself. My cousin, who had grown up with me, hadn't changed one bit. As we rode back home in a carriage, I lifted the curtain to take in the bustling streets. It was as lively as ever, no different from my memories. Rest for a few days after getting home. Later, your sister-in-law can take you out. Songjiang has plenty of new places to visit these days. When I have time, my cousin said softly, holding it in as we chatted. I nodded, agreeing to everything. The courtyard I stayed in was still as it was before I got married, spotlessly clean and carefully maintained. My cousin's wife, who had a straightforward nature, chatted with me for ages. Before leaving, she even took Nin with her. Having been married for years with only one son, she was quite taken with Nin, saying she wanted to dote on her for a few days. Oddly enough, Nin, who was always criticized as timid and dull by the Chen family, seemed like a completely different child here. She smiled more, was unafraid of people, and left happily with my cousin's wife without a single tear. I had worried she might struggle to adjust, but it seemed my concerns were unfounded. On the 3rd day after my return to Songjiang, my uncle handed me the deed to a shop my parents had left behind years ago. When I married, all my parents' assets were sold for cash and given to me as dowry, except for the shop. My uncle had said it was the first shop my father had bought when he was young and wanted to keep it as a memento. At the time, thinking it would be difficult to return to Songjiang, I had given the shop to my uncle. Who would have thought it would come back to me after all these years? I tried to refuse, but my uncle was insistent. You're raising a child on your own with no stable income. How could I rest easy? How could your parents rest easy? Years ago, I kept the shop because I saw that Chen Jijing wasn't truly devoted to you. It was meant as a backup plan for you. Even if I didn't give it to you now, it would eventually be yours after I'm gone. Smiling, I accepted it, but I couldn't hold back my tears when I turned away. The shop my parents had left behind was a clothing store, and its business was thriving. The monthly income was more than enough to support Nin and me. After visiting the shop a few times, I suddenly remembered how, in my youth, I used to draw clothing designs. Back then, my imagination ran wild, and my sketches were often unusual and whimsical. I searched through the storeroom and found an old box filled with my drawings from before I got married. Picking 2 designs, I made some adjustments and had the seamstresses create the outfits to display in the shop. I intended it as a simple experiment, but the clothes sold within a day, and several young ladies even requested custom orders. With time on my hands, I spent my days drawing designs with Inen, overseeing the seamstresses, and occasionally balancing the accounts. I was happily busy. It was so different from my time in the Chen household, where every step was fraught with caution. Success was taken for granted, while failure brought scolding and blame. Here, no matter what I did, my uncle and cousin were fully supportive. My cousin's wife was even more encouraging. Your designs are so good. You shouldn't worry about not selling them. You should worry about people not being able to buy them. Their praise boosted my confidence, and I found myself wanting to spend all day at the shop. As business flourished, I discussed with my family about acquiring 2 adjacent shops that were up for sale, planning to combine them into one large store. Everything was progressing splendidly. Occasionally, I thought of Chen Jijing and Chen Yan, but those memories felt distant and dreamlike until I heard Chen Jijing's name again. It was one afternoon, half a year later. A group of noble ladies came to order dresses. I was behind a screen, balancing the accounts, when I overheard their conversation. That Chen Jijing sure is lucky. The Crown Prince's first move after being reinstated was to get him reassigned to the capital. Now he's serving as a censor, conducting imperial inspections, a truly glorious position. Right? My aunt in the capital mentioned that he used to be smitten with a girl when he was young. Everyone in the city knew about it. Apparently, the girl either divorced or was widowed. I can't remember exactly. But for her, he even abandoned his first wife. Whether she's divorced or widowed, if they were truly in love, they would have been together long ago. Why wait until now? It's just a show, barely convincing at that. Let's just enjoy this spectacle. They laughed quietly as they spoke. I snapped out of my thoughts and noticed ink dripping onto the ledger. Smiling faintly, I closed the account book and went to the backyard to check on Anin. What I didn't expect was to see Chen Jijing himself that very evening. Uncle sat at the head of the table with a gloomy face, while Chen Jijing, dressed in official attire, sat quietly at the lower end. I handed the sleeping Anin to my cousin and entered the room to greet them. Uncle's expression lightened slightly, and he stood up to remind me, "I'll wait outside. If you need anything, just send someone for me." I nodded, and only after the door closed did I look toward Chen Jijing. His face was full of exhaustion, and there were more strands of white in his hair. It made sense. Though he was now a prominent figure, being close to the emperor was like walking with a tiger. He had to be constantly cautious, and it was far from the glamorous life people imagined. Chang'e, Chen Jijing rubbed his forehead and spoke softly. I wasn't at home the day the divorce was decided. I didn't know my mother had agreed to it on my behalf. That wasn't my intention. Come back with me. Yes, it was the clan elders and Madame Chen who had agreed to the divorce. A few days before the divorce, Chen Jijing had escorted Lu Heng to Qingzhou to honor her parents, and he wasn't in the capital at the time. Uncle felt that delaying it could cause complications, so after discussing with me, he forcefully summoned the Chen family and pressured them to make a decision on the spot. The Chen family had planned to wait for Chen Jijing's return before discussing it, but Madam Chen immediately agreed without hesitation and even said harshly, "My son can marry a merchant's daughter only because of your family's favoritism, so it's better to divorce and not delay my son from marrying a new wife this year." Chindarin, I lowered my head, taking 2 steps back and bowed. Whether you agree or not, the divorce has already been finalized. The divorce papers, signed by Madam Chen on behalf of Chen Jijing, were delivered to the government office the next day. Now, there was no more connection between us. Is it because of Hengye? Chen Jijing sighed, his voice tinged with helplessness. I've said it before, she was an old friend of mine. You are my wife. Why can't you understand? Chindarin, if there's nothing else, please leave, I said, my expression unchanged. I didn't want to hear more about his past with Lu Heng. I'll send Heng away. Please don't make a scene, all right? Chen Jijing compromised. Her life has been difficult after her marriage. I can't just leave her like that. Chen Jijing, I couldn't listen anymore, cutting him off. Marrying you, my life has been difficult too. All the grievances I had suffered in the past surged forth like a tide. My child, born after 10 months of pregnancy, was taken back to the capital by your order, not raised by me. There was no respect, only disdain, and he kept calling someone else mother. Chen Yan, raised by Madam Chen, had always disliked me. After I returned to the capital, I found that he was spoiled by the elders, studying poorly. I took it upon myself to correct his studies, but he was ungrateful, openly showing animosity toward me and speaking ill of me every chance he got. Chen Jijing opened his mouth to retort. At the time, he had agreed to send Qinyan back to the capital for better teachers and conditions, but thinking of how Qinyan had become spoiled and unruly, and his studies in disarray, he fell silent. In the 4th year in the border city, there was a rebellion. And of course, you weren't here. The people thought you had fled. To calm them, I had to step in personally. During the chaos, I was stabbed, the blade poisoned. I swallowed bowl after bowl of antidote, and though I survived, my child survived too. But Enin was weak from birth and couldn't speak. Everyone despised her as a mute, even her own family. I smiled bitterly, my voice soft. Later, one of your attendants let something slip, and I found out you went to Qingzhou to see that Miss Lu. Chen Jijing's face turned pale as he recalled the events from that time. That year, Lu Heng had written from Qingzhou, saying she had been ill after a miscarriage and requested 100-year-old ginseng from him for her health. He worried, so he secretly went to Qingzhou with some attendants to deliver the medicine and visit an old acquaintance. But by coincidence, a rebellion broke out in the border city after he left. He rushed back to handle the situation with the troops, and it took 2 months before he returned home. By then, he had heard of his wife's poisoning, but when he saw she was fine, he assumed it wasn't serious and didn't take it to heart. Chen Jijing suddenly regretted not asking more questions, not being more concerned, and why he had gone to Qingzhou at all. Regret overwhelmed him. Thinking of my sensible and obedient daughter, my voice choked with emotion. I prayed day and night for Enin, searching for medicine everywhere, but your mother scolded me, calling me mad. For a mute daughter, I struggled like this, trying to protect her from your family's harsh words. I humbled myself, endured so many wrongs, but I thought you didn't know. It turns out he did not know. He just chose who to care about. Chen Jijing's hand, holding the teacup, trembled. Hot tea spilled onto his hand, and for a moment, he seemed dazed. Enin was raised by both of them, and of course, Chen Jijing doted on her. When he first learned she couldn't speak, he had sleepless nights and sought many doctors, but their conclusions were all the same. Later, he thought that even if she couldn't speak, it didn't matter. The Chen family couldn't even raise a daughter? He would take care of her for life, and she wouldn't suffer at home. But it turned out that the place where his wife and child had suffered the most was the very home that he had thought was warm and loving. Chen Jijing put down the teacup, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry, I didn't know you. Since we're already divorced, let's part on good terms. I stood and opened the door. It's late. Chindaran, please leave. The sky had darkened. After bidding farewell to Uncle, I returned to my quarters, but sleep eluded me. I had considered telling Chen Jijing about my past grievances, but he was always too busy. Every time I tried to speak, he would fall asleep before I finished, and eventually, I lost the desire to talk. Later, when I realized he had a white moonlight in his heart, someone he couldn't have, it seemed pointless to speak. I looked down at the sleeping Anin, and for a moment, I felt more at ease. At least, these 10 years were not all in vain. I thought that after saying so much, a person like Chen Jijing, who values his face, wouldn't come back. But the next day, when I returned from the shop, I saw him in the yard coaxing Anin. Uncle had a dark expression on his face. When he saw me return, he quietly asked, "What's he doing here?" When you divorced, his family was so disdainful of Anin. They practically wished she wasn't of the Chen family's blood. What's he up to now? At the time of the divorce, I had wanted to take my daughter with me, but the Chen family refused, since even though she was a daughter, she still bore the Chen surname. But Grandma Chen had agreed right away, saying, "What's so special? If the Jiang family wants her, let them take her. Let her take your surname, I don't care. There are plenty of women who could bear my son's children. It's not like we need this mute girl. Let him be." I didn't care much. After all, he's Anin's father. We can't stop him. Adults' matters don't concern the children. At least Chen Jijing had always been kind to Anin, and Anin liked him as a father. "Changyi, you're back." Chen Jijing was holding Anin with one hand and a chestnut cake in the other. "I saw some chestnut cakes on the way and thought you liked them, so I brought some for you." I glanced at it. It was from a famous shop in Songjiang, known for their limited daily supply. You had to get there early to buy them, and it was in the opposite direction from my house and the station, so it couldn't have been on his way. Uncle snorted coldly and mocked, "When did Changyi start liking chestnut cakes? I didn't know this was your favorite." Chen Jijing's hand, holding the chestnut cakes, froze midair, and his smile became forced. "You always used to make chestnut cakes, so I thought." I picked up the Nin, who was rushing towards me, and politely declined. "You're the one who likes chestnut cakes, Chindaran. Keep them for yourself." I turned and walked away. Behind me, Uncle's voice rang out. "With so many chestnut cakes, Chindaran won't have to worry about dinner. I'll excuse you from dining with us. Please go ahead." Uncle's tongue was as sharp as ever. Chen Jijing was staying in Jiangnan for a long time. He would visit Anin from time to time, and seeing that I didn't stop him, he became bolder. He often brought Anin into the shop to play, and when I was busy, he would sit with her in the backyard and study. I hoped he would leave soon, but just as I was thinking that, someone else came knocking. A woman in splendid clothes took off her hood, her gaze proud, which seemed a bit at odds with her delicate appearance. "You must be Jiang Changyi. I am Lu Heng." Her brief words snapped me back to reality. This was my first time meeting Lu Heng face to face. The beauty who had once been famous in the capital, time had treated her well, leaving no marks on her face. She was still as radiant as ever. "Miss Lu," I nodded in greeting and motioned for someone nearby to step aside. Lu Heng sat down directly on a nearby bench and spoke gently. "I've come from the capital to deliver you an invitation." As soon as she finished, her servant placed a large red invitation on the table. "Congratulations," I replied without much emotion, smiling as I took the invitation. "But my shop is very busy. I might not be able to make it. I'm not sure where Miss Lu is staying, but I'll have someone prepare a gift and send it to your residence in advance to congratulate you on your wedding. I am naturally staying at the station with Brother Jijing." "You." Lu Heng didn't finish her sentence before she was interrupted by Chen Jijing, who appeared from the backyard. "What are you doing here?" Lu Heng froze when she saw Chen Jijing, her eyes flicking between us. I picked up Anin and gently said, "Miss Lu, please don't misunderstand. Chindaran is here to see the child." Since you're staying with him at the station, I'll have someone send the gift there." "What gift?" Chun Jijing furrowed his brow. Lu Heng smiled shyly, her face flushing. "My family has arranged for us to marry. When you return to the capital, we will marry. It was a promise you made to me years ago. Now, we've finally endured the hardships." Chun Jijing's face changed drastically, looking increasingly terrible. "When did I agree to that? That was in the past. Now we are both married. I have a family. I will never marry you." Lu Heng's face turned pale as she looked at him in disbelief. I covered Anan's ears and took her to the carriage, then looked at my servant. "Tell them to argue somewhere else. Don't let it disturb my business. If they break anything, have them compensate according to the price." The servant hurried into the shop, and I didn't look at the two of them again. I motioned for the driver to head back to the residence. I thought that with Lu Heng's arrival, Chun Jijing wouldn't come back, but that very evening, he came again. The rain was pouring like a waterfall. I was about to rest when a servant came to inform me that Chun Jijing was standing outside in the rain, asking to see me. After a moment of consideration, I decided to take an umbrella and a lantern to meet him. Chun Jijing stood outside, looking disheveled. His voice was hoarse but urgent as he explained, "Chang'e, I never intended to remarry. In my heart, you will always be my wife. When we return to the capital, I will explain everything to my mother. I will not marry Lu Heng." "This is your business." I stood inside, holding my umbrella. "It has nothing to do with me." Chun Jijing leaned against the door, his voice filled with guilt. "Chang'e, I was wrong in the past, but in my heart, only you are my wife." He faltered, unable to continue. Tears mixed with the rain and fell to the ground. "I've always wondered, you and Lu Heng were so in love back then. Why didn't you marry her?" I asked, voicing the question that had been on my mind for many years. Chun Jijing seemed caught off guard by the question and froze for a moment. I smiled lightly and answered for him. "Is it because you already knew the Crown Prince might fall out of favor? You, as a member of the Crown Prince's faction, would have been implicated, and you feared that Lu Heng would suffer too, so you didn't marry her." I later found out that during that time, the Crown Prince was repeatedly offending the Emperor. Chun Jijing had been a companion to the Crown Prince and knew the father-son relationship well. It was no surprise that he could predict the Crown Prince's downfall. Chun Jijing's already pale face turned even paler. My suspicions were confirmed, and I couldn't help but smile bitterly as I remembered what he had said to his second brother years ago. Chun Jijing, I was also raised in a sheltered family. The desert winds in the border towns were so harsh, and you just felt lucky that the one suffering with you wasn't your beloved. Did you ever think of protecting me, the one everyone called a bad omen? Few people knew the true reason behind Chun Jijing and Lu Heng's separation. Many assumed that the Jiang family had pressured the Qin family into fulfilling their engagement, causing the breakup. Even Grandma Qin believed this, and she hated me for being the bad luck that caused her son's misfortune, always making things difficult for me. But Chun Jijing knew better than anyone why he married me, yet he never said a word in my defense. I didn't look at him any longer and reached for the door to close it. Since the outcome was already decided, it didn't matter what the answer was anymore. A month later, Chun Jijing, the Inspector General of Jiangnan, finally left. Before he departed, he had someone deliver a letter to me, but I didn't read it and had it burned right away. My life returned to normal, and as Anan grew, my memories of the Qin family began to fade. However, to my surprise, Chun Yen began writing to me. Initially, he asked how Anan and I were doing, and when I didn't reply, he wrote about how difficult his past few years had been. After Chun Jijing returned to the capital, there was a long period of turmoil. He didn't want to marry Lu Heng, but his mother, Chun Lao Tai Tai, threatened to die unless he agreed. Eventually, she forced him to give in. After the marriage, naturally, a child came. His biological mother secretly drugged him so that he could consummate the marriage. Somehow, this scandal spread through the capital, becoming the subject of ridicule, and it was passed down to Jiangnan. I had heard bits and pieces of it. Lu Heng quickly gave birth to a son. With her own child now, she became extremely hostile toward Qin Yan, her stepson, constantly ridiculing him and making his life difficult. It seemed that only then did Qin Yan recall his biological mother. He sent one letter after another to Jiang Nan. After learning all this, I stopped reading his letters, burning them as soon as they arrived. I didn't actively inquire about the Qin family's affairs, and when I occasionally heard rumors, I just smiled and moved on. Then, when Enin was 13, a major event occurred in the capital. The crown prince made a misstep before the emperor, who, enraged, ordered him confined for reflection. It wasn't a huge matter, but some people began stirring the pot, claiming the emperor was favoring his younger son and planning to replace the crown prince. They suggested that it would be better to act first than to wait to be controlled by the emperor. The crown prince, in his anger, declared a rebellion under the banner of clearing the court, trying to seize the throne. But the emperor was sharp, and the rebellion was quickly suppressed. The crown prince was deposed and committed suicide in prison, while his family was imprisoned. Officials aligned with the crown prince were purged, with some executed, others exiled, and those associated with them stripped of their positions or demoted. The Qin family was one of the families exiled. When I heard the news, I couldn't help but reflect. The place they were exiled to was the border city. Enin was very worried, so she sent some silver to the Qin family. She was afraid I'd be upset, so she wrote a long explanation. I read it and couldn't help but smile and shake my head. Gently, I reassured her. You remember how your father treated you and wished to repay him. How could I be upset? I'm just grateful that I brought you back to Songjiang and that you carry the Jiang surname. A letter severing all ties with the Qin family meant that Enin was no longer connected to them. She was Jiang Enin, my daughter, and had nothing to do with the Qin family. Enin was pleased by this and eagerly offered to give me a shoulder massage. Outside, the cold wind howled, but inside, the warmth from the charcoal fire crackled, making the atmosphere as warm as spring. It was once again the spring festival, and the past, like the wind, had long since scattered. The Qin family's exile happened to fall on the first day of the Lunar New Year. Ordinarily, criminals wouldn't be exiled at such a time, but the furious emperor cared little for customs. With a single command, the Qin family was set on their way to the border city in the midst of a heavy snowstorm. The adults and children of the Qin family cried in despair, and Qin Jijing, numb to it all, watched as his family suffered. At that moment, he realized that Jiang Changyi had been right to divorce him. If she had stayed, she would have been among them in that crowd. She had already suffered enough, and she deserved a peaceful life from here on. Qian Yan cried all along the journey, begging not to be exiled, asking to go to Songjiang and find his biological mother. No one paid him any mind. Eventually, he began shouting at Qin Jijing, asking why he had been exiled and why Enin didn't have to be exiled. He was beaten by the guards escorting the prisoners. He fell silent for a time, but then began blaming Lu Heng. It's all your fault. If it weren't for you inciting things back then, my mother wouldn't have left me. Lu Heng, who had always been aloof and proud, suddenly broke down, losing her composure like a shrew, shouting at Qin Yan, "It's your own fault. You're so stupid, thinking your own mother was bad and wanting to make someone you've known for only a few days your mother." The two, who had once been close, became bitter enemies, and their insults escalated into violence. Qin Jijing didn't intervene. He had fallen ill. He had been brooding for years, and now the situation only worsened. He was supported by others, stumbling along with the group as they journeyed to the border. The snowstorm worsened day by day, and family members continued to fall ill. First, the old madam passed away. Then, Lu Heng's son died. Later, Lu Heng, humiliated by the guards, took her own life. Qian Yan also fell ill, suffering from a high fever. With no medical care, he died within 2 days. In the end, it was Qin Jijing, who appeared to have little time left, who persisted through the journey and died just as they reached the border city. Before he passed, he suddenly recalled the time when Lu Heng had been afraid of being implicated. She had hesitated, unwilling to directly say it, and Chen Zhijing, being sharp, had understood. He had told her that he was already promised to another and would not marry her, urging her to find another suitor. Then he had gone to Songjiang, seeking to marry. It was there, in that winter, that he met Jiang Chang'e, his fiancée. She was a young woman dressed in a pale yellow jacket, smiling brightly. The old uncle from the Jiang family didn't seem pleased with the match, making veiled remarks that suggested he wanted Chen Zhijing to give up. Jiang Chang'e, however, grew anxious and stood up to tug at her uncle's sleeve, saying, "I'm willing to marry." Chen Zhijing smiled, a joyous smile, and stretched both hands into the air, trying to grasp something. But in the end, he grabbed nothing, and everything slipped away.